A police dog lay down in front of a bus door, and what he was protecting left everyone speechless. Just one dog, one moment, one decision that would change everything. In the next few minutes, you're going to witness a story about unconditional loyalty so powerful that it will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, sacrifice, and what it truly means to protect someone. This isn't just a feel-good story about a heroic dog. This is about a moment that left an entire crowd of people absolutely speechless. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why. Let's go. Officer Marcus Reed had been a police officer for 17 years. He'd seen things that would break most people. He'd faced danger that would make ordinary people's blood run cold. He'd stood over crime scenes that haunted his dreams. He'd looked into the eyes of people at their absolute worst. He'd made decisions that saved lives and decisions that cost them. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever tested him the way Shadow did. Shadow wasn't just a dog. Shadow was the reason Marcus woke up in the morning. Shadow was the reason Marcus had a reason to live. Shadow was the reason Marcus believed that redemption was possible, that broken things could be healed, that love could exist in a world that often felt like it had none left to give. It started 3 years ago, on a call that Marcus will never forget. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, and the weather was just starting to turn warm. Spring was coming, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. Marcus didn't know it yet, but his new beginning was waiting for him in an abandoned warehouse on the east side of the city. They found Shadow in that warehouse, chained to a radiator, starving, covered in scars. The dog had been used for fighting, trained to be vicious, trained to be a weapon, trained to see humans as either masters or enemies. His ribs were visible through his matted fur. His eyes were hollow. His body bore the marks of a life spent in pain and fear and violence. When Marcus approached that chain, Shadow lunged. The dog's teeth were bared. His eyes were wild. Everything about that moment screamed danger. Everything about that moment screamed, "Stay away. I will hurt you. I am broken beyond repair." But Marcus saw something else. Beneath the aggression, beneath the trauma, beneath the survival instinct that had been beaten into this dog's soul, Marcus saw potential. He saw a life that could be saved. He saw a being that deserved a second chance. He saw something in Shadow's eyes that most people would have missed. A flicker of something that wasn't quite dead yet. A spark that suggested that maybe, just maybe, this dog had once known kindness. Most officers would have called animal control. Most would have written a report and moved on. Most would have recommended euthanasia, a mercy killing for an animal too damaged to save. The paperwork would have been filed. The decision would have been made, and Shadow would have been gone. But Marcus stayed. He sat on that warehouse floor for 3 hours, not moving, not forcing anything, just being present. He didn't try to grab the chain. He didn't try to prove his dominance. He just sat there, breathing, existing in the same space as this terrified, traumatized animal. And slowly, so slowly that Marcus almost missed it, Shadow's breathing changed. The dog's ears stopped being pinned back against his skull. The wild look in his eyes softened, just barely. Just enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there was still something human in this traumatized animal. There was still something that remembered what it felt like to be loved. It took 6 months of work, 6 months of patience, of gentle training, of showing Shadow that not all humans were cruel. 6 months of Marcus coming home to his empty apartment after long shifts and wondering if he was wasting his time. 6 months of doubt, of frustration, of moments when Marcus questioned whether he was helping Shadow or just prolonging his suffering. But Marcus didn't give up, because Marcus understood something fundamental about broken things. They don't heal on their own. They heal because someone decides they're worth saving. They heal because someone is willing to invest time, energy, and love into their restoration. They heal because someone believes in them when they can't believe in themselves. And Shadow healed. The transformation was gradual at first, then sudden. One day Shadow was still flinching at loud noises, still hesitant to trust, still carrying the weight of his trauma in every movement. The next day, or so it seemed, Shadow walked into the police academy training program and became the most dedicated, most focused, most determined K-9 officer anyone had ever seen. It was like Shadow understood, on some deep level, that Marcus had given him his life back. And Shadow was determined to honor that gift. He was determined to prove that his life had value. He was determined to show that a dog who came from nothing, who had known only pain, could become something extraordinary. Their bond became legendary in the department. Other officers would joke that Marcus and Shadow were the same person in different bodies. They could communicate with a glance. Shadow could read Marcus's mood before Marcus himself understood what he was feeling. When Marcus was stressed, Shadow would rest his head on Marcus's lap. When Marcus was angry, Shadow would position himself between Marcus and whatever was causing the anger, as if to say, "I've got this." When Marcus was sad, Shadow would refuse to leave his side, would stay pressed against him through the night, offering silent comfort. It wasn't just a working relationship. It was a partnership built on mutual devotion. It was something deeper than duty or training or professional obligation. It was love. Marcus had never been married. He'd never had children. His relationships had all fallen apart because he was married to his job, married to the badge, married to the responsibility of protecting his community. He'd watched partners leave because they couldn't compete with his commitment to his work. He'd seen friendships fade because he was always on call, always ready to drop everything if duty called. He'd resigned himself to a life of solitude, believing that was the price of his profession. But with Shadow, there were no conditions. Shadow didn't care that Marcus worked 70-hour weeks. Shadow didn't care that Marcus sometimes came home covered in the dirt and pain of the world. Shadow didn't care that Marcus had scars, physical and emotional, that he carried from his years on the force. Shadow just cared that Marcus was there. That was enough. That was everything. And for Marcus, Shadow was everything. People would see them walking through the neighborhood, and they'd smile. Shadow had this way of making people feel safe. He was massive, a German shepherd with a chest like a barrel, and eyes that seemed to see into your soul. But he was gentle. He was kind. He would let children pet him, would sit patiently while elderly people scratched behind his ears, would somehow know who needed comfort and who just needed to see that goodness still existed in the world. He was a bridge between Marcus and humanity. A reminder that even in a job that often exposed you to the worst of people, there was still beauty, still kindness, still hope. Marcus had saved Shadow's life. But Shadow had saved Marcus's life too, in ways that Marcus was only beginning to understand. There was a moment, about a year into their partnership, when Marcus was at his lowest. He'd made a mistake on a case. A suspect had gotten away because of a split-second decision Marcus made. It was a judgment call. It was the kind of decision that police officers make thousands of times in their careers. But this time, the suspect had gone on to hurt someone. Marcus carried that weight. He carried the knowledge that his failure had caused someone else's pain. He carried the guilt of knowing that if he'd made a different choice, if he'd acted a fraction of a second faster, if he'd trusted his instincts differently, that person wouldn't have been hurt. He came home that night thinking about ending it all. He was sitting on his apartment floor at 3 a.m. in the dark, with a bottle of whiskey and thoughts that were too dark to speak aloud. He was thinking about how much easier it would be if he just didn't wake up tomorrow. He was thinking about how his absence might actually make the world better, how his mistakes might stop hurting people if he wasn't around to make them anymore. Shadow found him there. The dog didn't bark, didn't try to pull him up or snap him out of it with some dramatic gesture. Shadow just lay down next to Marcus and rested his head on Marcus's leg. And they sat together in the darkness for hours. Shadow's presence was a reminder. You are not alone. You matter. Your life has value. And I need you. I need you to be here. I need you to survive this moment. Because you saved me. And now I'm saving you. Marcus put the bottle down. He called his therapist the next morning. He started healing. And he understood, in a way he'd never understood before, that Shadow had saved his life that night. Not with heroics or drama, but with simple, unconditional presence. With the willingness to sit in the darkness alongside someone who was suffering. With the knowledge that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply refusing to let someone face their pain alone. That was their bond. That was what they meant to each other. By the time of the incident at the transit hub, Marcus and Shadow had been partners for 3 years. They'd worked hundreds of cases together. They'd been through training that would break most teams. They'd proven themselves time and again as one of the most effective canine units in the city. They'd tracked suspects through dense forests. They'd found missing children. They'd comforted victims. They'd stood together through situations that would have shattered ordinary partnerships. But more than that, they were family. They were home to each other. Marcus trusted Shadow with his life, and Shadow would have died for Marcus without hesitation. That was the depth of their connection. That was the power of what they'd built together. But neither of them knew that, in just hours, Shadow would face a choice that would test everything they'd built together. And the consequences would be far more devastating than anything they'd ever experienced. Neither of them knew that the bond they'd forged would be pushed to its absolute limit. Neither of them knew that what was about to happen would force them both to understand, in the most profound way possible, what it truly means to sacrifice everything for someone you love. The morning of March 15th started like any other morning. Marcus woke up at 5:30 a.m. before his alarm went off. He'd been doing this for 17 years. His body clock was set to the rhythm of law enforcement. Shadow was already awake, waiting by the bedroom door, his tail wagging slowly as if to say, "Good, you're up. Let's go do something important today." They went through their morning routine. Coffee for Marcus, fresh water and kibble for Shadow. A walk through the neighborhood where they greeted Mrs. Chen, who was already tending to her garden, and old Mr. Patterson, who always had a treat for Shadow tucked in his pocket. These moments, these small, ordinary moments, were the ones that made life worth living. They were the moments that reminded Marcus why he did what he did. By 8 a.m., Marcus and Shadow were at the precinct. The morning briefing was routine. A few reports of break-ins in the downtown district. A missing person case that had gone cold 3 months ago. The usual chatter of officers preparing for their shifts. Marcus listened, with half his attention while Shadow lay at his feet, his eyes tracking the room with the awareness of a dog who'd learned to read human behavior. At 10:47 a.m., the call came in. We've got a situation at the Central Transit Hub. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. Multiple reports of a suspicious package on bus line 7. Bomb squad is en route, but we need K9 units for immediate assessment. Marcus was already moving. Shadow was on his feet before Marcus even said the command. They'd done this 100 times before. It was routine. It was what they trained for. It was just another day at the office. The Central Transit Hub was a massive transportation center in the heart of the city. Buses came and went constantly. Hundreds of people moved through it every hour. Commuters, tourists, students, elderly people, families with children. It was one of the busiest transit points in the city, which meant that any potential threat was a potential catastrophe. When Marcus and Shadow arrived, the scene was already in controlled chaos. Police had cordoned off the area around bus line 7. Passengers were being evacuated, though some were confused, some were annoyed at the disruption. And some, the ones who'd heard the word bomb, were genuinely frightened. Officers were moving people back, creating a perimeter, establishing a safe zone. The bus itself was parked in its designated spot, doors open, seemingly empty. But there, on the floor just inside the bus, visible even from a distance, was a backpack. A black backpack, sitting alone on the floor of the bus like an abandoned piece of luggage. Or like a bomb. Marcus approached the scene with Shadow at his side. Captain Rodriguez was there, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force and a reputation for keeping his head in crisis situations. "Read," Rodriguez said, nodding at Marcus. "We got the call about 20 minutes ago. Someone saw the backpack, reported it immediately. No one's touched it. No one's been in or out of the bus since it was discovered. Bomb squad is 15 minutes out. But I'd feel a lot better if you and Shadow could take a look first. Get us a preliminary assessment." Marcus nodded. This was exactly what they trained for. Shadow was one of the best explosive detection dogs in the city. His nose could identify explosive materials with an accuracy rate that exceeded 98%. If there was a bomb in that backpack, Shadow would know. "Let's go, Shadow," Marcus said quietly. They approached the bus slowly, methodically. Marcus had learned long ago that how you moved mattered. Sudden movements could trigger panic. Slow, deliberate movements conveyed control and confidence. Shadow moved beside him, his senses already heightened, his training taking over. The backpack was still there, sitting on the floor like a dark omen. Marcus and Shadow stopped about 10 feet away. This was far enough to be safe, close enough for Shadow to do his job. "Search," Marcus commanded. Shadow's entire body changed. His ears perked up. His nose went to work. He moved forward slowly, methodically, his senses focused entirely on the backpack. Marcus watched his partner work, reading the subtle signals in Shadow's body language. The slight tilt of the head, the pace of his breathing, the way his tail moved. Shadow circled the backpack once, twice. He stopped, his nose pointing directly at the bag, and then he sat down. In explosive detection training, a sit is a positive alert. A sit means there is explosive material here. A sit means danger. Marcus's heart rate spiked, but his face remained calm. He'd trained for this. He knew how to respond to this signal. He immediately moved backward, creating distance between himself, Shadow, and the backpack. "We've got a positive alert," Marcus called out to Rodriguez. "There's explosive material in that backpack." The scene erupted into controlled activity. Officers began expanding the evacuation perimeter. People who'd been standing nearby were moved back further. The situation escalated from suspicious package to confirmed explosive device. The stakes just went from high to life or death. Bomb squad arrived 12 minutes later. They set up their equipment, established their own perimeter, and began their assessment. Marcus and Shadow were moved back to a safe zone, about 100 yards from the bus. They watched from a distance as the bomb squad technicians approached the backpack with their equipment, their protective gear, their years of training and expertise. But something was wrong. Marcus could feel it. He'd learned to trust his instincts over his 17 years on the force. His instincts had saved his life more than once. His instincts had guided him to make the right calls in situations where there was no time for careful deliberation. And right now, his instincts were screaming that something wasn't right about this situation. The backpack was too obvious. It was sitting right there on the floor of an empty bus, where anyone could see it. If someone wanted to plant a bomb, would they really just leave it sitting out in the open? Wouldn't they hide it? Wouldn't they try to conceal it? Marcus watched as the bomb squad technicians approached. They were moving slowly, carefully, using their equipment to scan the backpack from a distance. They were professionals. They knew what they were doing. But then Marcus noticed something else. There was a person on the bus. Marcus's eyes narrowed. He looked more carefully at the interior of the bus, at the shadows in the back. And there, barely visible in the darkness of the rear of the bus, was a figure. A person, sitting in the back seat, completely still, completely silent. Marcus's hand immediately went to his radio. "We've got a civilian on the bus," he said urgently. "Rear seating area, approximately 10 feet from the backpack." There was a moment of silence. Then Rodriguez's voice came back. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Marcus said. "There's definitely someone back there." The scene shifted again. This wasn't just a bomb. This was a hostage situation, or a suicide situation, or something worse. The person on the bus could be a victim, could be a perpetrator, could be someone who was planning to detonate the device. The bomb squad paused. They were now dealing with two variables instead of one. The backpack and the person. The danger and the potential victim. Marcus watched as the bomb squad commander made a decision. They were going to approach the bus. They were going to try to evacuate the person. They were going to try to control the situation before it escalated further. But something still felt wrong. Marcus looked at Shadow. The dog was alert, his senses attuned to the situation. Shadow could feel the tension. Shadow could sense the danger. And then Marcus realized what was bothering him. Shadow had alerted on the backpack. Shadow had identified explosive material. But Shadow hadn't alerted on the person. Shadow hadn't indicated any danger from the human on the bus. Which meant one of two things. Either the person on the bus wasn't a threat, or the person on the bus was something else entirely. Marcus's mind raced through the possibilities. What if the person on the bus was in danger? What if the person on the bus was the one who'd planted the backpack and was now having second thoughts? What if the person on the bus needed help? The bomb squad commander was speaking into his radio, coordinating with officers on the ground, establishing a plan to approach the bus and evacuate the civilian. They were moving carefully, methodically, trying to contain the situation. But Marcus could see it now. The person in the back of the bus was moving, slowly, deliberately, as if they were reaching for something. "Stop!" Marcus shouted into his radio. "The civilian is moving. They're reaching for something." The bomb squad commander paused. Everyone froze. The situation hung in a moment of terrible suspension, where anything could happen. And then, from the back of the bus, a child's cry pierced the air. Not a shout, not a scream of fear. A cry. The sound of a small child, frightened, confused, calling out. Everything changed in that instant. Marcus didn't think. He didn't deliberate. He didn't follow protocol or wait for authorization. He looked at Shadow, and in that glance, they made a decision that would change everything. "Come on, Shadow," Marcus said quietly. "We've got work to do." And together, they ran toward the bus. Marcus ran toward the bus with Shadow at his side. Behind him, he could hear Rodriguez shouting into his radio. Could hear the bomb squad commander calling out commands, could hear the organized chaos of a situation spiraling beyond anyone's control. But Marcus's focus was singular. There was a child on that bus. There was a child in danger. Everything else fell away. The bus doors were still open. Marcus and Shadow bounded up the steps, their footsteps echoing in the hollow interior of the vehicle. The backpack was still there on the floor, a dark shape in the dim light. But Marcus's eyes were fixed on the back of the bus, on the shadows where he'd seen movement, where he'd heard the cry. "Police, don't move!" Marcus called out, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon, though he didn't draw it. He needed to assess the situation first. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he could make out the figure more clearly now. It was a woman. She was sitting in the back seat, and cradled against her chest was a small child, a boy, no more than 5 or 6 years old. The boy was crying, his small body shaking with fear and confusion. The woman looked up at Marcus, and in that instant, he saw everything he needed to know. This wasn't a terrorist. This wasn't someone who wanted to hurt people. This was a desperate person. This was someone who was drowning. This was someone who'd reached the end of their rope and didn't know what else to do. "Please," the woman said, her voice breaking. "Please don't shoot. Please don't hurt him. He's just a baby. He didn't do anything wrong, please." Marcus's training kicked in. He'd been trained for hostage situations. He'd been trained to de-escalate. He'd been trained to read people and understand their emotional states. But more than that, his humanity kicked in. He could see the pain in this woman's eyes. He could see the desperation. He could see a mother or someone who loved this child, who was terrified and out of options. "I'm not going to shoot," Marcus said calmly, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm Officer Marcus Reed. I'm here to help. Oh, what's your name?" The woman hesitated. Her grip on the child tightened slightly. The boy continued crying, his small fists clutching at her shirt. "My name is Sarah," the woman said finally. "This is my son, Daniel. We didn't mean to cause trouble. I just didn't know what else to do." Marcus took a step forward, slowly, deliberately. Shadow moved with him, the dog's presence somehow calming rather than threatening. Shadow had an instinct for human emotion that Marcus had never fully understood. The dog seemed to sense that this was a person in pain, not a person who needed to be attacked. "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice gentle but authoritative, "I need you to tell me about the backpack. Is that yours?" Sarah's face crumpled. Tears began streaming down her cheeks. The boy, Daniel, looked up at her with confusion, his crying quieting slightly as he sensed his mother's distress. "It's not a bomb," Sarah said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It's not a bomb. I promise it's not a bomb. It's just stuff. It's just things. I was trying to make a point. I was trying to get attention. I was trying to make someone care." Marcus's mind raced. She'd planted a backpack that tested positive for explosive material. But she claimed it wasn't actually a bomb, which meant either she was lying or the backpack contained something that registered as explosive but wasn't actually dangerous. Or she'd made a mistake. Or she'd been coerced into doing this by someone else. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Marcus said, taking another step forward. He was now about 15 feet from her, close enough to see her clearly, far enough to maintain a safe distance. That backpack registered positive for explosive material. The bomb squad is outside, and they're going to want to secure it. But right now, I need to understand what's happening. I need to understand what you're doing here with Daniel. Sarah looked at the backpack, then back at Marcus. Her eyes were desperate, pleading. "I lost my job," she said, the words spilling out like a confession. 3 months ago, my company went under. I've been looking for work ever since, but nobody will hire me. I've got no savings. I've got no family. It's just me and Daniel. We've been living in shelters. We've been eating at soup kitchens. I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I did something big enough, something dramatic enough, someone would notice. Someone would care. Someone would help. Marcus felt something break open in his chest. This wasn't a terrorist. This wasn't someone plotting to hurt people. This was someone who was desperate. Someone who was suffering. Someone who'd made a terrible decision out of desperation and fear. "And the backpack?" Marcus asked gently. "What's in it?" "Fertilizer?" Sarah said quietly. "Just fertilizer. I read online that it could be used to make explosives, so I thought if I left it here, if I made it look dangerous, someone would take us seriously. Someone would help. But I didn't actually make anything. I didn't actually put anything together. I just wanted someone to care that we exist, that we're suffering." Marcus understood now. She'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. She'd created a panic. She'd shut down an entire transit hub. She'd put hundreds of people at risk. But she'd done it not out of malice, but out of desperation. Out of a mother's love for her child and a desperate need for help. "Okay," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm. "Okay, Sarah, I hear you. I understand. But I need you to do something for me right now. I need you to stay calm. I need you to keep Daniel calm. And I need you to trust me." Sarah nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "The bomb squad is going to come in here," Marcus continued. "They're going to secure the backpack. They're going to make sure everything is safe. But they're not here to hurt you. They're here to help. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded again. "And after that, we're going to get you and Daniel to safety," Marcus said. "We're going to make sure you get the help you need. We're going to make sure you're taken care of. I promise you that." It was a promise he had no authority to make. It was a promise that depended on systems and bureaucracies and people who might not be as compassionate as Marcus hoped they would be. But it was a promise he made anyway. Because in that moment, this woman and this child needed to believe that someone cared. Someone needed to stand in the darkness with them and say, "You matter. Your suffering matters. I see you." Shadow had moved closer now and was sitting at Marcus's side. The dog's presence seemed to calm Sarah further. She looked at Shadow, and something in her expression shifted. It was as if Shadow's calm, steady presence was communicating something that words couldn't. You are not alone. There is goodness in this world. There is hope. Marcus raised his radio to his lips. "Rodriguez," he said, We've got a non-hostile situation. The backpack contains fertilizer, not explosives. The civilian is cooperative. We need bomb squad to proceed with caution and secure the package, but there's no active threat. There was a pause. Then Rodriguez's voice came back, calm and professional. Copy that, Reed. Bomb squad is standing by. We're going to proceed with standard protocol. Keep the civilian calm. Will do, Marcus said. Over the next few minutes, the bomb squad entered the bus with their equipment. They approached the backpack with the same care and precision they would have used if it actually contained explosives. They scanned it. They secured it. They placed it in a containment unit. The entire process was methodical and professional. Sarah watched with Daniel, her arm around the boy, keeping him calm. The child had stopped crying now, his fear replaced by confusion and exhaustion. When the backpack was secured, the bomb squad commander, a woman named Captain Lisa Torres, approached Marcus and Sarah. The backpack is secure, Torres said. We'll run additional tests, but based on preliminary assessment, there are no active explosive devices. This woman should be taken into custody for questioning. But there's no immediate danger. Marcus nodded. He understood the protocol. Sarah had committed a crime. She'd created a public panic. She'd endangered lives. There would be consequences. But Marcus also understood something else. Consequences without compassion were just cruelty. As the officers came to take Sarah into custody, Marcus did something that probably violated a dozen regulations. He knelt down in front of Daniel. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said gently. "I want you to know something. You're very brave, and your mom loves you very much. And we're going to make sure you're okay. Can you do me a favor?" Daniel looked at Marcus with wide, tear-filled eyes and nodded. "Can you say hello to Shadow?" Marcus asked, gesturing to the dog. Daniel's eyes widened. He looked at Shadow, who was sitting calmly, his tail wagging slowly. "Shadow is a police dog," Marcus explained. "He helps people, and he's very good at it. He's very brave, just like you." Daniel reached out tentatively and touched Shadow's head. Shadow's tail wagged faster, and for just a moment, in that small gesture, there was a connection. There was a reminder that even in situations filled with desperation and pain, there was still kindness. There was still hope. As Sarah was led away by officers, she looked back at Marcus with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for not treating us like criminals. Thank you for seeing us as human beings." Marcus nodded. He didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. He just watched as she and Daniel were carefully led out of the bus. When they were gone, Marcus stood in the empty bus, surrounded by the remnants of a crisis that had been averted. He looked at Shadow, and the dog looked back at him with those intelligent, knowing eyes. "We did good today, boy," Marcus said quietly, running his hand over Shadow's head. "We didn't just prevent a disaster. We helped someone who was drowning. We showed them that they matter." Shadow leaned against Marcus's leg, and they stood together in the silence of the bus. Two beings connected by a bond that transcended words or training or protocol. They stood together in the knowledge that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply see someone, simply acknowledge their humanity, simply refuse to treat them as disposable. The paperwork took hours. Marcus sat in the precinct's administrative office, filling out forms, writing reports, documenting every decision he'd made at the transit hub. The official narrative was straightforward. Officer Reed and K9 Shadow responded to a reported suspicious package, identified it as non-threatening, and successfully de-escalated a hostage situation without injury or loss of life. But the real story, the story that mattered, was far more complex. Shadow lay at Marcus's feet, his head resting on his paws, watching his partner work. The dog hadn't left Marcus's side since they'd returned to the precinct. It was as if Shadow understood that something significant had happened today, something that had shifted the axis of their shared world. By 6 p.m., Marcus was finally cleared to leave. Captain Rodriguez had pulled him aside before he left, shaking his hand with a grip that conveyed respect and something deeper. An acknowledgement that Marcus had done something right today, something that went beyond the standard protocol. "You handled that well, Reed," Rodriguez had said. "A lot of officers would have gone by the book, would have treated her like a criminal first and a human being second. You saw the person. That's rare. That's important." Marcus had nodded, but he hadn't said anything. Because the truth was, he hadn't done anything extraordinary. He'd simply treated Sarah the way he would have wanted to be treated if he were drowning. He'd simply chosen compassion over judgment. He'd simply remembered that behind every crime, every desperate action, there was a human being with a story. Now, as Marcus drove home with Shadow in the passenger seat, his mind kept returning to Sarah and Daniel. What would happen to them now? Sarah would face charges. That was inevitable. Creating a public panic was a serious offense. But what about Daniel? What about the child who'd done nothing wrong except be born to a mother who was struggling? Marcus made a decision. When he got home, instead of collapsing on the couch like he normally would after a long shift, he made phone calls. He called social services. He called the prosecutor's office. He called every contact he had in the system. He explained Sarah's situation. He advocated for her. He made it clear that this wasn't a case of a dangerous individual. This was a case of a desperate person who needed help, not punishment. It took 3 days of phone calls, emails, and conversations. But by Friday, Marcus had connected Sarah with a legal aid attorney who specialized in cases like hers. He'd also connected her with a social worker who could help her navigate the system, find housing, find employment assistance. He'd made sure that Daniel would be placed in temporary foster care with a family that had been vetted and approved, ensuring the boy would be safe and cared for while his mother worked to rebuild her life. It wasn't a perfect solution. The system was imperfect. The help available was inadequate. But it was something. It was more than Sarah would have had without Marcus's intervention. On Saturday morning, Marcus received a visitor at his apartment. It was Sarah's attorney, a woman named Jennifer Chen, who worked for the legal aid office. She'd asked to meet with Marcus to discuss the case. "I wanted to thank you," Jennifer said, sitting in Marcus's living room with a cup of coffee. Shadow was at her feet, his head tilted, studying her with those intelligent eyes. "What you did for Sarah, it's not something we see very often in the criminal justice system. Most officers, most people in positions of authority, they see someone like Sarah and they see a criminal. They see someone who's done something wrong and needs to be punished. But you saw a person in crisis. You saw someone who needed help, not judgment." Marcus shrugged. "I just did what I thought was right." "That's exactly the problem," Jennifer said. "Doing what's right shouldn't be extraordinary. It should be standard. But in our system, it is extraordinary. And that's a tragedy." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Sarah wanted me to tell you something," Jennifer continued. "She wanted you to know that your kindness, the way you treated her, the way you treated Daniel, it changed something in her. She's been in the system for a long time. She's been treated like she's disposable, like she doesn't matter. But when you looked at her, when you saw her as a human being, it reminded her that she's still worth saving. She's committed to rebuilding her life. She's going to plead guilty to the charges, but she's also going to use this as a turning point. She's going to get the help she needs. She's going to be the mother that Daniel deserves. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. He'd done what he could. He'd shown up. He'd treated Sarah with compassion. But he hadn't known, couldn't have known, how much that would matter. He hadn't known that a simple act of human kindness could be the difference between someone giving up and someone fighting to survive. "And there's something else," Jennifer said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a drawing. It was crude, done in the style of a 5-year-old, with bright colors and simple shapes. It showed a man and a dog, and a small boy petting the dog. At the bottom, in childish handwriting, it said, "To Officer Marcus and Shadow, thank you for being nice to us." Marcus took the drawing, and his eyes filled with tears. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't try to maintain professional composure. He just let the tears come, because in that moment, he understood something fundamental about his life. For 17 years, he'd been a police officer. He'd done his job well. He'd protected his community. He'd upheld the law. But it wasn't until today, until he'd chosen compassion over protocol, until he'd treated a desperate person as a human being instead of a criminal, that he'd understood what it truly meant to make a difference. Shadow, sensing Marcus's emotion, moved closer and rested his head on Marcus's knee. The dog's presence was grounding, centering, a reminder that they were in this together, that they were partners not just in law enforcement, but in life, that they were connected by something deeper than training or duty. They were connected by love. Marcus was back at the precinct, back to his regular routine. But something had changed. He found himself approaching calls differently. He found himself taking extra time to understand people's situations. He found himself advocating for compassion within a system that often prioritized punishment. His fellow officers noticed. Some of them thought he was going soft. Some of them thought he was wasting his time. But others, the ones who understood what he was trying to do, they started following his example. They started asking questions. They started seeing people instead of criminals. It was a small change. It was barely noticeable in the grand scheme of things. But it was a change nonetheless. One afternoon, Marcus received a letter in the mail. It was from Sarah. She'd been released pending trial, and she'd been placed in a transitional housing program. She'd found part-time work at a local grocery store. Daniel was doing well in his temporary foster placement. The family had decided they wanted to keep him, and Sarah had agreed to work toward reunification while maintaining Daniel's stability. The letter was handwritten, the words careful and deliberate. "Dear Officer Reed, I wanted to write to you to let you know how much your kindness meant to me. When I was at my lowest, when I thought no one cared, you showed me that I still matter. You showed me that I'm still human. You showed me that there are people in this world who choose compassion even when it would be easier to choose judgment. I'm working now. I'm in housing. I'm getting the help I need. And most importantly, I'm going to be reunited with Daniel soon. We're going to have a life together. We're going to be okay. I want you to know that you didn't just save my life that day at the transit hub. You saved my soul. You reminded me that I'm worth saving. Thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for treating me like a human being. Thank you for showing me that hope still exists." With gratitude and respect, Sarah Marcus read the letter, 3 times. Each time, he felt the same overwhelming sense of purpose. This was why he did what he did. Not for the accolades or the recognition, not for the statistics or the case closures. He did it because it mattered. Because people mattered. Because every interaction was an opportunity to either diminish someone's humanity or affirm it. That evening, Marcus sat on his apartment balcony with Shadow beside him, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The city stretched out below them. Millions of people living their lives, struggling with their own challenges, carrying their own burdens. "We made a difference today, boy," Marcus said, running his hand over Shadow's head. "Not just today. Every day. Every time we choose to see people as human beings. Every time we choose compassion over judgment. We make a difference." Shadow leaned against Marcus's leg, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the world turn. Marcus stood in a community center in the downtown district, watching Sarah receive her certificate of completion from a job training program. She'd worked hard over the past year. She'd completed her court-ordered community service. She'd rebuilt her relationship with Daniel. She'd gotten her life back on track. And now she was standing on stage, accepting recognition for her accomplishment. Her son sitting in the audience with his foster family, who had officially become his adoptive family, cheering her on. After the ceremony, Sarah found Marcus in the crowd. She hugged him, and he hugged her back. And for a moment, they were just two human beings acknowledging the connection between them. The connection that had been forged in a moment of crisis and had blossomed into something deeper. A reminder that redemption is possible, that people can change, that hope is never truly lost. "I wanted you to know," Sarah said, stepping back to look at Marcus, "that I'm starting a new job next month. It's a good job. It's stable. It has benefits. Daniel and I are going to be okay. We're going to have a real life. And it's because of you. It's because you saw me when everyone else looked away." Marcus shook his head. "You did the work," he said. "I just reminded you that you were worth the effort." Sarah smiled, and there was peace in that smile. There was healing. There was hope. Later that night, Marcus sat in his apartment with Shadow, reflected on everything that had happened. The incident at the transit hub had been a turning point not just for Sarah, but for Marcus himself. For 17 years, he'd been a good police officer. He'd done his job well. He'd protected his community. But he'd been operating within a system that often treated people as problems to be solved rather than human beings to be understood. Shadow had taught him something that no academy training ever could. That the most important work you can do is simply being present for people, simply seeing them, simply refusing to treat them as disposable. Shadow had saved his life when Marcus was suicidal. But in the past year, Marcus had come to understand that Shadow hadn't saved him through dramatic heroics. Shadow had saved him through presence, through love, through the simple, powerful act of refusing to let Marcus face his darkness alone. And now, Marcus was trying to extend that same presence to others. He was trying to see people the way Shadow saw people, not as criminals or problems or statistics, but as beings worthy of compassion and understanding. It wasn't a perfect system. The criminal justice system was still broken. There were still people who fell through the cracks. There were still injustices that needed to be addressed. But Marcus had learned that change didn't have to come from sweeping reforms or grand gestures. Change could come from individual choices, from individual acts of compassion, from individual officers choosing to see people as human beings. Shadow rested his head on Marcus's lap, and Marcus stroked the dog's ears, feeling the warmth of the connection between them. "We're going to keep doing this," Marcus said quietly. "We're going to keep seeing people. We're going to keep choosing compassion. We're going to keep making a difference, one person at a time." Shadow's tail wagged slowly, as if in agreement. And in that moment, Marcus understood the true meaning of their bond. It wasn't just about a man and a dog. It was about two beings who'd chosen to see the good in each other, who'd chosen to love each other unconditionally, who'd chosen to extend that love to others. It was about redemption. It was about hope. It was about the unbreakable bond that forms when two souls decide that the other person, or in this case, the other being, is worth saving. It was about love in its purest form. 2 years had passed since the incident at the Central Transit Hub. Marcus was now 45 years old, and Shadow was entering his 8th year of life. In dog years, Shadow was approaching his senior years, though you wouldn't know it to look at him. The dog still had the energy and focus of a younger animal. Though Marcus had noticed subtle changes, a slight stiffness in Shadow's movements on cold mornings, a tendency to rest more frequently, a quietness that suggested the dog was thinking deeply about things. Marcus understood. They were both aging. They were both carrying the weight of years of service, years of seeing the worst and best of humanity, years of making choices that would ripple outward in ways they couldn't always predict or control. The police department had undergone significant changes in the past 2 years. Captain Rodriguez had retired and been replaced by a younger commander who was more progressive in her approach to community policing. Several of Marcus's fellow officers had begun implementing the compassion-first protocols that Marcus had pioneered. The department had started a community outreach program focused on understanding the underlying causes of crime rather than simply punishing the symptoms. It wasn't perfect. The system was still broken in many ways, but it was changing. And Marcus liked to think that his choices and Shadow's presence had played a role in that change. Sarah had thrived. She'd completed her job training program and had secured a permanent position as a manager at a local nonprofit that helped homeless and at-risk individuals. She'd been reunited with Daniel, who was now 8 years old and thriving in school. They'd moved into a small house in a quiet neighborhood. Sarah had even started volunteering with other people who were struggling, using her own experience as a bridge to help them find hope. She visited Marcus and Shadow once a month. It had become a ritual. She would bring Daniel, and the boy would spend an hour playing with Shadow, laughing, throwing a ball, experiencing the simple joy of connection with an animal that asked nothing of him except presence. On one of these visits, Sarah had told Marcus something that he'd never forgotten. "You know what the most important thing you did for me was?" she'd asked, sitting on Marcus's apartment balcony, while Daniel and Shadow played in the yard below. Marcus had shaken his head. "It wasn't the phone calls," Sarah continued. "It wasn't the connections you made or the resources you found. It was that you looked at me and you didn't see a criminal. You didn't see a failure. You didn't see someone who was disposable. You saw a person. You saw a mother. You saw someone who was worth saving. And that belief, that one person's belief in my worth, it changed everything. It made me believe in myself again. It made me want to be the person you saw in me." Marcus had cried that day. Not the quiet tears he'd shed when reading her letter, but deep, soul-shaking tears that came from a place of understanding the true weight of his responsibility as a person in a position of power and authority. By the 3rd year after the Transit Hub incident, Marcus had been approached by the police academy about developing a training program focused on compassionate policing and de-escalation. It was an opportunity that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. But times were changing. The department was recognizing that the old approach, heavy-handed, aggressive, focused on punishment, wasn't working. Crime rates hadn't decreased. Community trust hadn't improved. If anything, the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served had only widened. Marcus had accepted the position with one condition: Shadow would be part of the training program. "I want recruits to understand something fundamental," Marcus had told the academy director. "Police work isn't just about enforcement. It's about connection. It's about understanding. And if we can teach officers to connect with a traumatized animal, to understand its needs, to communicate with it effectively, to build trust with it, then maybe they can learn to do the same with traumatized people." The director had been skeptical at first, but after observing Marcus and Shadow work together, after seeing the way, the dog responded to Marcus's calm presence. After understanding the depth of the bond between them, she'd agreed. The program, called the Shadow Protocol, became one of the most popular and effective training programs in the academy. New recruits would spend time with Marcus and Shadow, learning not just about canine handling, but about the principles of compassionate policing. They would watch Shadow work, would observe how the dog responded to calm, patient leadership. They would learn that authority didn't have to be aggressive, that control didn't have to come from fear, that the most effective way to lead, whether you were leading a dog or leading a community, was through trust, respect, and genuine concern for the other being's well-being. One of the recruits in the program was a young woman named Officer Maya Patel. She was sharp, intelligent, and idealistic. But she was also struggling with the cognitive dissonance between the compassionate policing she was learning from Marcus and the aggressive tactics she was seeing in the field. "How do you do it?" she'd asked Marcus one afternoon after a particularly difficult training session. "How do you stay compassionate when the system is so broken? How do you keep believing in people when you've seen the worst of what they're capable of?" Marcus had thought about this question carefully. It was a question he'd asked himself many times over the past few years. "I don't stay compassionate because the system is perfect," Marcus had finally answered. "I stay compassionate because the system is broken, because people are suffering, because every person I interact with is a human being with a story, with struggles, with reasons for their choices. And my job isn't to judge them or punish them. My job is to understand them. My job is to see them. My job is to treat them with dignity, even when they haven't treated others with dignity." He'd paused, then continued. "And I stay compassionate because of Shadow, because this dog came from nothing. This dog was abused and traumatized and trained to be a weapon. But he chose to trust again. He chose to love again. He chose to see the good in people, even though people had only shown him cruelty. If Shadow can do that, then I can do that. If Shadow can choose hope over despair, then I can choose compassion over judgment." Officer Patel had nodded slowly, and Marcus could see something shift in her expression. It was as if she'd been given permission to be the kind of officer she wanted to be. Permission to let her compassion guide her decisions. Permission to believe that change was possible. It was during Marcus's annual physical that the doctor mentioned something that made Marcus's heart stop. "Your blood pressure is elevated," the doctor said, reviewing the test results. "And I'm seeing some early signs of stress-related health issues. How are you managing stress?" Marcus had thought about this question. He'd thought about the weight of his job, the weight of the stories he carried, the weight of knowing that his choices could change lives in ways both positive and negative. "I have Shadow," Marcus had answered simply. "He helps me manage." The doctor had smiled. "That's good. That's very good. But I want you to think about retirement. You're 45 years old. You've put in a lot of years of service. You've made a real difference. But you need to think about your own well-being. You need to think about what comes next. The word retirement had struck Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been a police officer for 19 years. It was his identity. It was his purpose. The thought of stepping away from that, of stepping away from Shadow, was almost unbearable. But he'd also seen what happened to officers who didn't retire gracefully. He'd seen them cling to a job that was destroying them. He'd seen them lose themselves in the work, lose their families, lose their sense of who they were outside of the badge. He didn't want that for himself. And more importantly, he didn't want that for Shadow. That night, Marcus sat with Shadow on the apartment balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness. "We're not getting any younger, are we, boy?" Marcus said quietly, running his hand over Shadow's head. The dog's muzzle was graying now, white hairs mixing with the black. Shadow's eyes were still sharp, still intelligent. But there was a weariness there that hadn't been present before. Shadow leaned against Marcus, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of two beings who'd spent nearly a decade together, who knew each other's moods and needs without words. "I'm thinking about retiring," Marcus continued. "I'm thinking about stepping away from the force. And I'm wondering what we're going to do with ourselves. What's our purpose if we're not out there making a difference?" Shadow didn't answer, of course. But the dog's presence, steady, calm, accepting, suggested that maybe purpose wasn't something you had to chase. Maybe purpose was something you created simply by being present for the people and beings you loved. 3 months later, Marcus made his decision. He would retire from the police force, but he wouldn't stop working. Instead, he would establish a non-profit organization focused on training police officers in compassionate policing practices. He would continue to work with Shadow, but in a different capacity. They would become educators, mentors, advocates for a different approach to law enforcement. The announcement of his retirement was met with mixed reactions. Some officers saw it as a loss. Some saw it as an inspiration. Some saw it as a betrayal of the traditional values of law enforcement. But the community response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people Marcus had helped over the years, people whose lives had been touched by his compassion, came to his retirement ceremony. Sarah was there with Daniel. Officer Patel was there. Community, leaders, social workers, teachers, and ordinary citizens who'd been impacted by Marcus's approach to policing. Captain Rodriguez, now retired himself, gave a speech about Marcus's legacy. "Marcus Reed is the kind of officer we need more of," Rodriguez said, his voice steady and authoritative. He understood that policing isn't about control. It's about service. It's about seeing people. It's about treating everyone, regardless of their circumstances, with dignity and respect. And he had a partner who embodied those values better than any human could. Shadow taught us all something important, that love and trust are more powerful than fear and force. When it came time for Marcus to speak, he kept it brief. He talked about Shadow. He talked about the importance of seeing people. He talked about the responsibility that came with wearing a badge and the power that came with choosing compassion. "I'm leaving the force," Marcus said. "But I'm not leaving the work of building a more just, more compassionate society. That's not something that ends when you take off the badge. That's something that continues for the rest of your life. And I'm grateful to have a partner who understands that. A partner who's been teaching me about compassion and unconditional love for nearly a decade." He looked at Shadow, who was sitting at his side, his head held high, his eyes alert and aware. Shadow came into my life when I was broken, Marcus continued. And he healed me, not through words or therapy or medication, though those things have their place. He healed me through presence, through love, through the simple act of refusing to give up on me when I'd given up on myself. And now, I want to spend the rest of my life helping others do the same. Helping people see that they're worth saving, that they're worth loving, that they're worth the effort. 6 months into his retirement, Marcus had established the Shadow Foundation for Compassionate Policing. The foundation provided training programs, mentorship, and resources to police departments across the country that wanted to implement compassionate policing practices. Shadow, now 9 years old, had become the face of the foundation. Posters of Marcus and Shadow hung in police academies. Videos of them working together were used in training programs. And Shadow's story, the story of a traumatized dog who learned to trust again, who learned to love again, who learned to see the good in people, became a metaphor for the kind of transformation the foundation was trying to create in law enforcement. Officer Patel had become one of the foundation's lead trainers. She'd worked with Marcus to develop advanced training modules focused on trauma-informed policing and de-escalation techniques. She'd also become a mentor to other young officers who wanted to practice compassionate policing in a system that often discouraged it. Sarah had joined the Foundation's board of directors, bringing her lived experience to the organization's decision-making process. She'd become a powerful advocate for understanding the root causes of crime and addressing them with compassion rather than punishment. And Daniel, now 10 years old, had become Shadow's unofficial ambassador. He would visit schools and community centers with Marcus and Shadow, telling his story about how an officer's compassion had saved his family, about how a police dog had shown him that goodness still existed in the world. On a sunny afternoon in late spring, Marcus sat in the Foundation's new office, a renovated community center in the heart of the downtown district, watching Shadow interact with a group of police recruits who'd come for training. The dog moved among them with grace and authority, allowing them to pet him, teaching them through his presence what it meant to be calm under pressure, what it meant to project strength without aggression, what it meant to lead through trust rather than fear. One of the recruits, a young man who'd grown up in the foster care system, was having a particularly profound moment with Shadow. The dog had positioned himself next to the recruit, and the young man was crying silently, his hand on Shadow's head, experiencing something that Marcus recognized immediately: the healing power of unconditional love and acceptance. Marcus didn't interrupt. He simply watched and understood. This was the real work. This was the real purpose, not the statistics or the case closures or the commendations. The real purpose was moments like this, moments when a human being felt seen, felt valued, felt like they mattered. Shadow looked up at Marcus across the room, and their eyes met. In that glance, there was an entire conversation. There was an acknowledgement of the journey they'd taken together. There was a reminder of why they'd chosen this path. There was a confirmation that their bond, forged in trauma, strengthened through love, expressed through service, was exactly what the world needed. 5 years after retiring from the police force, Marcus Reed dedicated his life to the Shadow Foundation for Compassionate Policing. As he approached his 50th birthday, he noticed his beloved K9 partner, Shadow, was aging. Despite the signs of arthritis and kidney issues, Shadow remained a beacon of love and wisdom. Marcus organized a community event called Pause for Compassion to celebrate the bond between law enforcement and the community. The event was a success, filled with laughter and joy. As Marcus spoke about compassion and understanding, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for Shadow's impact on his life. However, as the months passed, Shadow's health began to decline. After consulting with the vet, Marcus made the difficult decision to let Shadow go peacefully at home, surrounded by love. In the days following Shadow's passing, Marcus found solace in continuing their work. He proposed a scholarship program in Shadow's honor to support K-9 officers and emphasize the importance of compassionate policing. Months later, Marcus received a call from a local shelter about a young Labrador mix named Max, who had a troubled past. Marcus decided to meet him, feeling a spark of connection. Over the following weeks, he built trust with Max using the compassionate training principles he had learned with Shadow. As Max transformed, Marcus brought him to community events, showcasing the bond they were building. At a holiday celebration, Marcus introduced Max to the crowd, emphasizing the importance of compassion and understanding. Years later, Marcus watched Max interact with children at a community event, reflecting on their journey together. He had embraced the lessons Shadow had taught him, learning that love knows no bounds and every new bond was an opportunity to continue spreading compassion. With Max by his side, Marcus was excited for the future, ready to carry on the legacy of love and understanding that began with Shadow.